AQA A-level psychology examiner report. It was pleasing to see how many students coped well with the first sitting of this paper, answering the required number of questions in the time available. There was evidence of good time management and planning as relatively few students appeared to run out of time. The combination of multiple choice, short answer, and essay style questions enable students to play their strengths, and although some clearly disliked the extended writing, most did a reasonable attempt at answering essay-style questions to match the format across options within each option group seemed to work well and meant that students had a similar experience. Many students structured their extended responses appropriately into paragraphs and used punctuation effectively. Although the general standard of communication was reasonably sound, the use of psychological terminology was frequently inappropriate, and there was a widespread tendency to sprinkle any and every answer with terms such as reductionist and nomothetic. This occurred particularly where students seemed to have been tutored along the lines of legacy specification A requirements for issues, debates, and approaches. In all extended writing, teachers and students should be aware that debates will still gain credit in extended writing if they are pertinent to the question, but there is no longer a requirement to present them whether they are relevant or not. Question 1. This question was correctly answered by 62% of students. Question 2. This question was correctly answered by 71% of students. Question 3. This was generally well answered, although students sometimes forgot to make reference to the headline and simply provided a definition of beta bias. Occasionally, the response was focused on the issue of age rather than gender. Question 4. Where students understood the concept of beta bias, this is well answered. The most common suggestion was to include women in the sample, but equally credit-worthy suggestion of ensuring the results of the male-only study were generalized to only males was also seen occasionally. Responses to suggesting female-only research did not gain credit, although a lenient view was taken here if the response implied that findings from a female-only sample would be also considered. Question 5. This question was answered generally well. Most students could suggest a valid problem, including some explanation of how it might affect the study of the outcome. Less successful responses cited concepts such as social desirability or demand characteristics without offering any explanation of how these factors might operate in this situation. Suggestions of alternative ways measuring the distance usually focused on some sort of technological advice, for example, steppers, GPS trackers, phone apps, and Fitbits. Occasionally, students forgot to answer any alternative or impractical suggestion, such as covert observation. Some students appear to have completely misapprehended the question and offered bizarre solutions, for example, measuring the height and tread of the stairs, converting this into miles. Question 6. Most students were able to identify at least two types of determinism, although descriptions of what followed were often vague. Use of terminology was frequently inappropriate. For example, behavioral determinism and psychological determinism were seen in place of environmental and psychological determinism. Whilst understanding of biological and environmental determinism was usually sound, psychic determinism was usually less well presented, with many students failing to explain the key point that behaviour is covered by the unconscious. There was a widespread tendency to conflate the broad types, such as soft and hard, with specific types, such as biological and environmental. Application was usually sensible, if fairly perfunctory, although many answers showed that thoughtful and sustained application. Quite sensibly, discussions of the types of determinism in relation to various approaches in psychology often illustrated their points with reference to the specific topic. Unfortunately, some students became sidetracked into a discussion on the approaches or the nature-nurture debate and completely lost focus of the question. Many discussions often confused determinism and reductionism. Consideration of the implications of the answers. A number of students fairly presented the ineffective pre-prepared essays based on free will and determinism debates. Section B, relationships. Question 7. Students did well on this question, getting the majority of 2 marks. Question 9. There were many full mark responses to this question, although a significant number incorrectly identified the situation as the grave dressing phase. The simplest route to achieving full credit was to identify the relevant phase, summarize the main aspect points, then link to the STEM material. Weaker responses were those where the student had contributed no knowledge or understanding of the stage, but merely copied whole chunks of them from the STEM. Although there was some minimal credit that could be achieved by matching characters to the correct phase, as this was an application question, answers without any links should receive no credit. Question 10. Answering focus mainly on the reduced cues theory, hyperpersonal model and absence of gating, and the implications of some or all of these 4 levels of self-disclosure. Weaker responses tended to describe these theories and were often repetitive. Better answers included the use of evidence to support arguments and analysis in relation to general psychological concepts such as de-individuation and anonymity. Analysis of the differences between face-to-face relationships and relationships on social media provided a useful route to many. Information on parasocial relationships was awarded credit if it was explained in the context of social media, which was rarely the case. More than most topic areas, this is one of the most appropriate use of psychological terminology and specific reference to evidence to help elevate an answer which might obviously seem like a common response. Section C, schizophrenia. Question 19, answered correctly by mass majority. Same for question 20. Question 21, students tended to respond well to this question up to a point, and the STEM afforded an ample opportunity for application. Most could offer useful description of behaviours typical of family dysfunction and were able to pick out relevant material from the STEM for application to Jack. It was less common to see full coverage of family dysfunction explanation for schizophrenia. In other words, students often fail to make link between particular dysfunction, high expressed emotion, double bind, etc., and behaviour typical of schizophrenia. Only students who explored this in their answers achieved higher marks. Other issues noted confusion between double bind and high expressed emotion, and an unfortunate but understandable tendency for students to refer to schizophrenic mother rather than the schizophrenic mother. Only rarely did students pick up on the reference at the dad who stayed out of it, as reference to a family schism / skew. Some students often wasted time offering evaluation, then having to rewrite the same material when they came to the next question. Question 22. Most students offer 2 valid limitations, although these were often cursory or insufficiently discussed. Blaming the family and the issues of the cause and effect were usually effective routes to credit. Comparisons with other explanations, mainly biological, were not always as effective as they tended to strain to the discussion of the alternative. A number of answers on the family therapy rather than on the explanation. The frequency seen assertion of the family dysfunction as an explanation is reductionist was surprising given the many and varied way in which families might be dysfunctional. and only serves to illustrate the wide misuse of them. Question 23. This question was usually well answered despite the fact the named drugs were often misspelt and the names appeared to have deliberately obscured by the use of wiggly handwriting. There was some excellent accounts on their action in less competent answers. Typical and atypical antipsychotics were confused, and in both in terms of name, actions, and side effects. Evaluations tended to cover up side effects, effectiveness, and comparison with alternatives. Occasionally, students considered the implications for the economy for good effect. Section D. Aggression. Question 34. A surprising number of students base their answer on social learning theory or social norms, making no mention of cognitive factors. Of those who did understand the concept, many managed to gain 1 mark for aggressive script, as memory based on past experience of aggressive situations seen on television, film, or computer games. Relatively few students gained the 2nd mark for pointing out how the script could be triggered by a similar situation. Note that reference to the media was essential for credit in this question. Most students could offer reasonable descriptions of dominance for question 37. Sexual jealousy and mate retention strategies, but these often failed to include any explicit mention of aggression or any explanation of how these behaviours have evolved. More able students emphasised the key mate retention tactics explicitly linked to aggression. Warfare and bullying were also used effectively. Despite wording of the question, it was fairly common to see description of animal studies, often sticklebacks, which could only gain credit if used as part of an evaluation. The way that this evolutionary explanation ignore biological explanations or ignore genetic explanations was often an evaluative point, showing basic misunderstanding. Similarly, it was sometimes stated that evolutionary explanations for aggression could not explain cases of genocide, with an apparent failure to recognise how elimination of an entire race would therefore confer advantage on the perpetrators who would survive, prosper, and propagate their own genes.